This first story comes from a narrator who, looking back on an incident from when he was 19, feels an immense sense of luck just to be able to share it. He begins by explaining that as a bigger guy, he rarely had to deal with the kind of creepy encounters that some of his friends did. But one particular experience in the small town of Pikeville, Kentucky, was a terrifying exception that has stayed with him ever since. He was living there for college, a place far removed from his northern Michigan home. Pikeville was the quintessential sleepy, low-crime town, a place where the air felt thick with humidity and a disarming sort of friendliness. Where a stranger striking up a conversation wasn't seen as a threat, it was just a normal part of the day. The setup for the encounter was mundane. His family was driving down for his birthday, and they had planned to meet at the local Hardee's. True to form, he was the punctual one, arriving a good 15 minutes early, while his family had a reputation for being perpetually, unapologetically late. So there he was, standing outside in the warm Kentucky morning, with time to kill and nothing to do but wait. It was then that a man approached him. First he seemed harmless, just another local looking to pass the time. But as the conversation unfolded, a series of unsettling red flags began to pop up. Flags that the narrator, in his youthful naivety, brushed aside. The stranger learned he was a college student and immediately claimed to have seen him at a party. This was the first crack in the facade. The narrator had never once been to a party in that town. He found himself nodding along anyway, a strange social reflex to avoid an awkward confrontation. The man then pivoted, talking about Dungeons & Dragons when he heard the narrator was a gamer, expertly finding common ground. All the while, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the stranger was taking casual sips from a bottle of alcohol, the sour smell faintly tainting the air between them and repeatedly offering him a drink. The conversation took a darker turn when the man launched into a sob story about losing all his friends to a drug habit. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, tapping directly into the narrator as youthful empathy and making him feel a pang of pity for this lonely stranger. Blinded by this misplaced sympathy, when the man asked if he wanted to walk around for a bit, the narrator, knowing his family was still a long way off, agreed. That was the critical mistake. With each step they took away from the relative safety of the Hardee's parking lot, the scenery began to shift. The well-kept lawns of the main street gave way to cracked sidewalks and overgrown yards. The friendly, open atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. Within 10 minutes, they were in a part of town the narrator had never seen before, a place that felt neglected and vaguely menacing. They stopped in front of a house that wasn't just abandoned, it felt malevolent. The paint was peeling, the porch was sagging, and the windows were like vacant black eyes. A dark, narrow alley clung to its side like a scar, promising nothing but shadow and secrets. The stranger gestured toward the derelict building and, with a leering smile, said he knew 2 girls who lived there, girls who loved to party, and asked if the narrator wanted to meet them. The invitation was so absurd, so transparently false, that it finally shattered the narrator's naive compliance. He was standing in a terrible part of town with a man who reeked of alcohol and talked of hard drugs, and nobody on earth knew where he was. He immediately declined, his voice tight, saying he needed to get back for his family. The stranger's friendly mask didn't just slip, it fell away completely. His eyes hardened, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Then came the second offer, the one that confirmed every screaming instinct in the narrator's head. Could he help him move a pool table into his van, which he added was conveniently parked just down that pitch-black alley? It was the classic chilling setup you see in horror films. He declined again, his heart pounding against his ribs. This is when the stranger began to slowly, deliberately reach into his jacket pocket. A wave of pure, cold terror washed over the narrator as he fully comprehended the danger he was in. In a moment of what can only be described as miraculous timing, his phone rang, its cheerful tone cutting through the tense silence. It was his stepmom, calling to check on his whereabouts. That phone call was a lifeline thrown into a pit. He seized the opportunity, speaking loudly into the phone about being on his way, and made a hasty retreat. The walk back was a nightmare in broad daylight. He didn't run, afraid of what that might provoke, but walked as fast as he could, the feeling of the stranger's eyes burning into his back. The creep followed him for 3 agonizingly long blocks, before finally melting back into the shabby neighborhood they had come from. It wasn't until later that the narrator learned the full horrifying context of his close call. That specific area of Pikeville was notorious for a high number of disappearances and was considered a hotspot for human trafficking. The friendly stranger wasn't just a creep, he was almost certainly a predator. The narrator still shudders to think what would have happened if his stepmom hadn't called. What lay waiting down that dark alley, and how easily a friendly conversation on a sunny morning nearly became his final story. The creeper in the office, this next one, comes from a guy who was just 16 at the time, living in one of those small rural towns where the illusion of safety is the most comforting thing you own. It's the kind of place where people leave their keys in their cars and their doors unlocked during the day. A community wrapped in a quilt of trust that feels impenetrable. His family owned a business there, but it wasn't on the quaint main street. It was situated far back off the road, a solitary outpost swallowed by a dense perimeter of trees. The business itself was run out of a modular office trailer, one of those temporary-looking boxes you see at construction sites, at thin-walled. A characterless structure that felt particularly vulnerable after the sun went down. The narrator admits that being there alone after dark always filled him with a low-grade, humming dread, a feeling that the encroaching woods held more than just shadows. One evening, well after business hours, his mother realized she had forgotten some important paperwork back at that isolated office. She mentioned she was going to drive out to get it, and immediately that familiar creepy feeling washed over the narrator. He pictured his mom alone in that tin can of an office, surrounded by the inky blackness of the woods, and a protective instinct kicked in. Mixed with a bit of teenage bravado, he volunteered to go for her, brushing off her concerns. The drive down the long gravel road felt different in the dark. The familiar shapes of the trees on either side seemed to morph into looming figures, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for his car. The usual sense of peace he felt in his town was replaced by a growing unease. When he finally pulled into the parking lot, the only illumination came from his headlights and a single, stark security light that cast long, distorted shadows across the gravel. The silence was profound. It had weight. He got out, the sound of his car door shutting, echoing unnaturally in the stillness. He fumbled with the key, the metallic click of the large deadbolt turning sounding like a gunshot. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, immediately flipping the switch. The harsh, flickering glare of the fluorescent lights did little to dispel the gloom, instead creating a sterile, artificial island of light in a sea of darkness. The layout was simple. The main office area was a sharp left from the entrance. A small bathroom was straight ahead, and to his right was a dark, cluttered storage room. The only way out was the door he had just come through, which was now at his back. He made his way to his mother's desk, his boots sounding loud on the cheap linoleum floor. He began shuffling through papers, the mundane task a stark contrast to the electric tension in the air, and then he heard it. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence, it was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate creaking noise that came from behind him, from the direction of the storage room. It was the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. Every muscle in his body went rigid, his breath caught in his throat, and a cold wave of adrenaline washed over him. He was instantly hyper-aware of his surroundings, the hum of the lights, the faint smell of dust and old coffee, and the terrifying fact that he was completely alone, with his back to the source of that sound. His mind, already primed by the creepy atmosphere, went into overdrive. He tried desperately to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation that would calm his racing heart. It had to be the wind, he told himself. An old building like this probably groans and settles all the time. Maybe a heavy tree limb had scraped against the metal siding. He clung to these explanations, but the primal part of his brain, the part that recognizes a predator in the dark, wasn't buying it. After what felt like an eternity of frozen silence, he knew he couldn't just stand there. He had to look. He slowly, painstakingly, gathered the courage to turn around. He peered into the doorway of the storage room, his heart hammering against his ribs. The light from the main office spilled into the room's entrance, illuminating stacks of old boxes and forgotten equipment, but the back wall was lost in impenetrable shadow. He strained his eyes, searching the darkness for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong. There was nothing. Just still, silent blackness. A small measure of relief trickled through him, but the feeling of being watched remained, a palpable pressure on the back of his neck. He told himself it was just the wind, found the documents his mom needed, and started his retreat. Every instinct he possessed was now screaming at him. One voice urged him to be brave, to step into that room and prove his fears were baseless. But a much louder, more ancient voice was screaming for him to just let it go, to get out while he still could. He listened to the second voice. His eyes never left the black doorway of the storage room, as he began to slowly backpedal towards the exit. He felt the cold, round knob of the main door press into his back. He didn't dare turn around. He reached behind him, fumbled with the handle, and pulled the door open, stepping backward out into the chilly night air. Never breaking eye contact with that dark, empty space, he reached back inside, slapped the light switch off, plunging the office into darkness, and slammed the heavy door shut. The solid thud of the deadbolt locking into place was the most comforting sound he had ever heard. He drove home the initial terror, slowly giving way to a sheepish feeling that he had overreacted. He never mentioned the incident to his family, not wanting to worry them or sound like a paranoid kid scared of the dark. The night's events were pushed to the back of his mind, dismissed as an overactive imagination. That is, until the next day, the news came, and the bottom dropped out of his world. They had discovered that the office had been broken into the night before. The window to the storage room had been shattered. They had been robbed. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The creaking noise he had heard wasn't the wind or the building settling. It was the sound of a person. A person who had been hiding in the absolute darkness of that storage room, just feet away from him, watching and waiting. To this day, he is haunted by the chilling what-ifs. What would have happened if he had investigated that noise? And worse, what would have happened if his mother had gone there alone, as she had planned? Story 3. Mary's Love. This next story is a different kind of terrifying. It's not about a monster in the woods or a home invader. It's a slow-burn psychological creepfest that unfolds in a place you'd least expect it. The story comes from a 17-year-old girl who at the time had just graduated high school and was working as a dietary aide at a local assisted living facility. She makes it clear this wasn't one of those cold clinical nursing homes you might picture. Instead, it was warm and inviting, more like a lavish old-world hotel where the residents lived with a degree of independence. Her job was straightforward. She helped prepare and serve meals, essentially acting as a waitress for the same group of elderly people every single day. Over the course of a year, she got to know nearly all of them, building the kind of gentle, friendly rapport that makes a place like that feel like a community. Among these residents was a woman named Mary. Mary was mostly deaf and lived in the facility with her 3 sisters. Because of the communication barrier, she was incredibly lonely. Often isolated in a world of muffled sounds and misunderstood words. The narrator, noticing this, made a special effort to reach out. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just the simple, kind gestures she offered to all the residents. A warm smile, a wave from across the dining room, a gentle, "How was your day?" But to Mary, these small acts of kindness were like a beacon in the fog. It excited her immensely, and she quickly latched on to the narrator. Mary's primary way of communicating affection was through touch. She would pat people on the shoulder, give them hugs, and hold their hands while talking. The narrator, though usually a bit jumpy about being touched, found that Mary's touch didn't make her uncomfortable at first. She saw it as a harmless and sweet way for a lonely woman to express a connection that words couldn't manage. But the affection began to escalate. What started as simple pats on the back soon progressed to full-on embraces. Then the embraces became punctuated with kisses, over and over again. This is when a sliver of discomfort began to creep in for the narrator. It wasn't a physical revulsion, but a growing fear of how these interactions might be perceived by others, especially given her own appearance. She had short hair and a somewhat masculine presentation, which often led residents with memory issues to mistake her for a young man. She had seen another coworker have to be physically separated from a resident who was pursuing her romantically. She worried her relationship with Mary might be misinterpreted as something it wasn't. Still, she reassured herself that Mary's intentions were pure, just an elderly woman showing love in her own way. Soon, Mary's affection morphed into a full-blown obsession. When she finished her meals, she would stand by the kitchen door for hours, simply watching the narrator as she washed dishes, waiting patiently for her to emerge. During the busiest times, Mary would wait for nearly an hour, her eyes fixed on the kitchen. When the narrator was out serving other residents, Mary's gaze would follow her across the dining room. Her coworkers and other residents found it sweet, even funny, but it was becoming suffocating. Mary was a tiny woman, but she possessed a surprising, wiry strength. When she got a hold of the narrator, she literally wouldn't let go. The narrator was forced to endure the hugs, the kisses, and the constant assurances of love until a coworker could intervene and explain that she had to get back to work. Even then, Mary would become strangely hostile and possessive, holding the narrator even tighter and whispering that she'd hold her for the rest of her life if she could. One night, the situation reached a terrifying new level. Mary was waiting for her as usual, and when a CNA gently told her the narrator had to work, Mary gave the aide the dirtiest, meanest look the narrator had ever seen. As the CNA walked away, Mary leaned in and whispered to the narrator, "I'll be back later." True to her word, as the narrator and a coworker were closing the kitchen, Mary reappeared. The narrator stepped out into the dining room to clean a counter, and Mary latched onto her. "No one can bother us now," Mary said, her voice clear and chillingly possessive. For the next 15 minutes, Mary held her in a vice grip, kissing her repeatedly and telling her how much she loved her. The narrator was trapped, unable to break free without physically shoving an elderly resident. The behavior became so disruptive that the facility's administration had to get involved. They instructed the narrator to avoid Mary, and the staff began closing the kitchen doors to keep her out. This is when the true horror of the situation was revealed. One evening, with the doors shut, Mary stood outside, banging on the glass and staring in at the narrator. A CNA went to her and told her she needed to leave the young woman alone to do her work. Mary's response sent a shockwave through the staff. "I want him," she snarled. The CNAs tried to explain to her that the narrator was not only a girl, but also a minor. This sent Mary into a complete frenzy. She started screaming that they were all lying, that she wanted to be with her man, and began making both physical and legal threats. A coworker later relayed the horrifying conversation to the narrator. All this time, the kissing, the touching, the obsessive holding it had all been romantic. When Mary had invited her to her room, it wasn't just to hang out, it was with sexual intent. The woman the narrator had thought of as a sweet, lonely, grandmotherly figure was, in her own confused mind, romantically and sexually obsessed with her. The narrator was left feeling stunned, horrified, and utterly violated.
Oh.
Forever haunted by the knowledge that the affection she had accepted out of kindness was rooted in something far darker and more disturbing than she could have ever imagined. Story 4. Jacob's obsession. This story takes us into the familiar, often fraught world of high school parties where social anxieties can quickly curdle into genuine fear. It's a chilling reminder of how unrequited affection can fester into a dangerous, terrifying obsession. The narrator begins by setting the scene. She and her close group of friends, Carol, Xander Marie, and Vanessa, were getting ready for a traffic light party being held at their high school. The plan was simple. Meet at Vanessa's house beforehand for some drinks. Classic pre-party ritual to ensure they'd have fun even if the main event turned out to be a dud. The mood was light, full of the easy camaraderie of teenage friendship. They were just kids looking for a fun night out, completely unaware of the menacing shadow that was about to fall over their evening. To understand the full weight of what happened, the narrator provides some crucial background on her friend, Carol. Carol had attracted the attention of a seriously creepy admirer named Jacob. He was a bit older, in the same class as their friend Marie, and had a reputation for being a huge pothead who was always experimenting with other substances. He was a known entity at school, constantly seen in a slow, weird haze, clearly high on something even during class hours. He had met Carol once briefly, at a previous party, and had immediately fallen into a deep, disturbing infatuation. In the days following that single minute-long conversation, he had bombarded her with texts, declaring that she had a heart of gold and was the light of his life. This understandably creeped Carol out immensely. She confronted him directly, telling him the feelings were not mutual and that they barely knew each other. Jacob did not take the rejection well. His infatuation twisted into an aggressive, simmering anger, and from then on, he would follow her with his eyes in the school hallways, his gaze like daggers. Fast forward to the traffic light party. The group arrived early, finding the school hall still mostly empty. They decided to hang out in a back room where the teachers had put out chips and soda, a quiet space to relax as they waited for more of their friends to show up. Eventually, feeling the party had picked up, they ventured out onto the crowded, pulsating dance floor. In the throng of bodies, they lost Vanessa, but the remaining fourth, a narrator. Carol, Xander, and Marie were dancing and having a good time. That is, until the narrator spotted him. It was Jacob, slowly and deliberately circling their small group like a shark. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. He was clearly under the influence of something potent. The narrator immediately warned the others, and a cold wave of anxiety washed over their fun. The festive atmosphere vanished. Their night turned into a desperate cat-and-mouse game. They quickly left the dance floor and slipped outside into an enclosed smoking area, hoping to lose him in the crowd of people out there. They started chatting with some other kids they knew, trying to act normal, to reclaim a piece of their night. But the relief was short-lived. The narrator looked across the enclosure, and there he was again, on the other side. Now with a friend in tow, his eyes fixed on them. The feeling of being hunted was becoming unbearable. They had to move again. This time, they retreated all the way back to the supposed safety of the teacher's back room. They sat down trying to catch their breath and calm their nerves, but the peace was shattered moments later. Guess who walked in? Jacob and his friend. They sat at a table directly behind them, and Jacob began repeatedly, openly pointing Carol out to his friend, his movements becoming more agitated. They fled the room once more, deciding to try and lose themselves on the dance floor again. For the next 30 minutes, they were in a state of hypervigilance. The narrator saw Jacob stalking them through the crowds multiple times, his presence a constant menacing weight. But now something had changed. His focus had shifted. It was now glaring at the narrator, giving her these intense, terrifying death stares. She recalls never having seen anyone look so purely, incandescently angry, especially someone she had never even spoken a word to. It was the kind of look that communicated a clear, violent intent. She was so scared that she didn't dare turn her back on him, terrified of what he might do if she gave him the opportunity. The final straw came when they went to the bar to get drinks. Jacob and his friend appeared yet again, and this time Jacob's aggression was boiling over. He tried to run towards them, a raw, uncontrolled rage in his eyes, but his friend physically stopped him, holding him back. He was close enough now that they could see the struggle, the sheer effort it was taking his friend to restrain him. As they stood there, frozen, he managed to lunge out in their direction. That was it. They had had enough. Pure survival instinct took over, and they made a run for it, their hearts pounding in their chests. They sprinted across the hall to the security guards posted by the entrance, and, breathless and terrified, told them everything that had been happening. The guards confronted Jacob, and the narrator watched as all the aggression drained out of him, replaced by the pathetic fear of getting caught. He almost crapped his pants. Later, back in the relative calm of the teacher's room, the narrator saw Jacob's friend, the one who had been holding him back. She recognized him from middle school and went over to talk to him. He confirmed their worst fears. Jacob was indeed high and not on alcohol. He apologized profusely on Jacob's behalf, acknowledging that his behavior was completely unacceptable. The narrator never saw Jacob again. She heard from Marie that he simply stopped showing up for school, disappearing as suddenly and unsettlingly as he had appeared in their lives. Story 5. The woman on the trail. This next account comes from a man who is no stranger to the dangers of the open road in the wilderness. At 21, he was an experienced road tripper and hiker, a man who felt more at home in the vast, lonely landscapes of the U.S. than most people do in their own neighborhoods. He prefaces his story by making it clear that he isn't easily spooked. He's had his fair share of genuinely dangerous encounters, the kind that would send most people running for the safety of the suburbs. He tells of a time in Kansas when he realized someone was methodically stalking his campsite in the dead of night, and another unsettling incident in Utah where he looked up to see a man staring at him over his campfire, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. These were moments of clear, understandable human threat. But what he experienced on a hot summer day in southern Indiana was something entirely different. It was a brief, silent encounter that left him more profoundly chilled and shaken than any armed man or shadowy stalker ever could. The setting was the Three Lakes Trail, a 10-mile loop that winds through the dense, humid forests of southern Indiana. It was a blisteringly hot day, the air thick and heavy, the kind of oppressive summer mugginess that makes you feel like you're breathing water. The narrator and a female friend of his had started their hike early in the morning to beat the worst of the heat, and the park was almost completely deserted. A few cars sat empty in the parking lot, but on the trail itself, they hadn't seen a single other soul for 3 hours. The trail was a circle, making it nearly impossible to get lost. And surrounded by the familiar sounds of the forest, the narrator found himself relaxing. He was deep in a good conversation with his friend, laughing and enjoying the day. And for the first time in a long time, he let his guard down. His usual state of cautious hyper-awareness, honed by years of solo travel and strange experiences, had melted away in the warmth of the day and easy company. They were making their way down a gentle slope that led into a sharp, blind left turn. The canopy of leaves overhead was so thick it cast the trail in a perpetual dappled twilight. Out of the quiet of the woods, a figure suddenly stepped around the bend, walking up the hill towards them. Her head was down at first, her stride powerful and rhythmic. She was of average height, but the immediate impression was one of incredible strength. She was far more muscular than a typical woman. She was wearing only a sports bra, short shorts, and a backpack, leaving most of her body exposed to the muggy air. Most of her body, he realized with a jolt, was covered in tattoos. But these weren't ordinary tattoos. They were a chaotic collection of bizarre shapes and symbols, abstract and alien, covering her arms, legs, and torso. There were no recognizable pictures, no flowers or skulls, no words in any language he could identify. It was like a script from another world written on human skin. As she drew closer, about 10 feet away from them, she lifted her head. And that's when everything inside the narrator just froze. His blood ran cold, and the easy chatter with his friend died in his throat. Her face was also covered in the same strange string-like symbols, tattooed across her cheeks and forehead. But it was her eyes that completely paralyzed him. He describes them as being nothing but black sockets. In the deep shade of the forest canopy, they were like two voids, two perfectly black circles that seemed to absorb all light. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that it wasn't makeup. He believed the skin all around her eyes was tattooed solid black. To compound the horror, she must have been wearing scleral contacts that covered the whites of her eyes, because there was no color. No sclera, nothing but pure, undiluted black. The entire effect was so profoundly unsettling that his brain struggled to process it. It was, as he put it, a face without human. Every horror movie he had ever seen, every story about a backwoods cult, every terrifying scenario his experienced mind could conjure ran through his head in a split second. But his body was locked in place, and some strange automatic social programming took over. He blurted out the most mundane, absurdly normal thing he could think of. "Good day for a hike." The words sounded hollow and ridiculous in the charged silence. The woman didn't respond. She didn't smile or nod or break her stride. She just looked at him with that same empty, inhuman stare, her black eyes seeming to look right through him. She held his gaze as she walked past, silent and impassive, her presence so alien and out of place that it felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. He and his friends stood frozen, watching as she continued up the hill and disappeared around the bend, her powerful steps not making a sound. The narrator has never been so shaken by an encounter in his life. He's faced down the barrel of a gun, but the silent, empty gaze of the woman on the trail is the image that truly haunts his nightmares. Story 6. The Blue Car. This next story is a chilling testament to how quickly a child's world of carefree innocence can be shattered. It's a tale about a presumed abduction attempt that happened in the broad, unassuming light of a suburban summer afternoon. Stark reminder that danger doesn't always lurk in the shadows. The narrator sets the scene over 10 years ago when his younger brother was just 6 years old. They lived in a typical suburban neighborhood, the kind with manicured lawns and kids playing in the front yards until the streetlights came on. Their summers were a blur of classic childhood activities, melting action figures with a magnifying glass, turning over rocks to find bugs, and meticulously following ant trails across the pavement. Us. It was a world that felt safe, predictable, and entirely their own. On this particular day, the afternoon was unfolding like any other. It was around 4 or 5 o'clock, the sun casting long shadows across the street. The narrator's mother was inside the house, busy with the mundane task of paying bills, while his 6-year-old brother was outside, lost in his own little world, probably engaged in one of his usual front-yard adventures. The quiet of the afternoon was suddenly broken by the sound of a car. A dark blue, low-riding car flashed down their street, moving much faster than the usual neighborhood traffic. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Their next-door neighbors had 2 teenage sons who owned a similar car and had a habit of speeding home. So the little boy, conditioned by the familiar rhythms of his street, initially thought nothing of it and went right back to his play. But the car didn't continue down the road. A moment later, a window rolled down, and a man's voice called out, "Hey!" to the little boy. The brother jerked his head up, and in that instant, he realized this was not his neighbor's car. The man behind the wheel was young, probably no older than 25. With close-cropped hair so blonde it was almost white and a ruddy reddish complexion. In the passenger seat sat another young man, described as either Hispanic or Native American, with a dark complexion. Before the little boy could even process this strange new element in his familiar world, the situation escalated with terrifying speed. The car swerved abruptly, parking next to the neighbor's house. In a matter of seconds, the passenger door flew open, and the dark-complected man bolted from the car. Lunging directly for the 6-year-old boy, what happened next was pure, primal instinct. A surge of animal panic and adrenaline flooded the little boy's system. He didn't freeze. He ran, scrambled up, and sprinted for the front door of his house, crying and screaming in terror.
Ah!
His mother, hearing the frantic sounds, instantly knew something was terribly wrong. She ran outside, her mind flooded with the protective rage that all mothers know. She was just in time to see the blue car speeding away, its exhaust trailing behind it like a dirty gray flag. She caught a glimpse of the car and its occupants, but, in the frantic moments, was unable to get the license plate number. She immediately called the police to report the attempted abduction. But this is where the story takes another frustrating and frightening turn. The police, according to the narrator, took their sweet time. They arrived at the house a full hour later. They took down the information from the distraught mother and the terrified little boy, but their attitude was dismissive, almost shrugging. They said there was nothing they could do, and didn't seem particularly concerned about the gravity of what had just happened. The narrator's mother argued with them, but they just took her information and left. He doubts they even filed an official report. The narrator is still haunted by the grim possibilities of what those men wanted with his little brother. Their small town was close to a much bigger city, and he can't help but think that they had scouted his brother, seeing him as an easy target for human trafficking, or something even worse. The incident left a permanent scar on their family. He shudders to think about the countless ways it could have ended in tragedy, if the timing had been just slightly different. If his brother hadn't had the agility to run, if his legs had turned to jelly with fear, instead of pumping with adrenaline, if the front door had been locked, or if their mother hadn't been home. In those few terrifying seconds, 2 strange men in a blue car stole his and his brother's childhood innocence. They could no longer play outside in their own front yard with that same carefree sense of safety. The world had shown them its teeth, and the suburbs never felt quite the same again. Story 7. The Man in the Jaguar. This next story is a masterclass in modern-day horror. A chilling account of how a single, unwanted advance at a traffic light can spiral into a relentless stalking campaign that shatters a young woman. A sense of security. The narrator was in her 2nd year of university back in 2015, living at home in a fairly upscale condo complex. She had an expensive car, a gift from her parents. It was as beautiful as it was conspicuous. It was painted a very distinctive rose gold. In her safe, comfortable city, she never felt threatened, and often drove with her windows down, enjoying the peaceful autumn air. Having attended an all-girls private school in another country, she admits she was quite naive and inexperienced when it came to dealing with compliments or aggressive advances from strange men. This innocence would soon be weaponized against her. It began on a perfectly normal morning. She was leaving her condo's parking garage, waiting at the signal to make a left turn. A sleek, expensive Jaguar pulled up beside her. She didn't think anything of it until the driver, a man who looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, rolled down his window and gestured for her attention. Thinking he needed directions, she turned down her music. His first words were, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Flattered but completely uninterested, she had a boyfriend. She gave an awkward thanks. The man, however, was not deterred. He immediately and aggressively insisted that she give him her phone number so they could go out for coffee. As he yelled his demands across the gap between their cars, people on the sidewalk began to stare. Panicked and desperate for the light to change, the inexperienced young woman did what scene characters do in movies. She gave him a fake number, hoping it would be a quick and easy end to the uncomfortable encounter. As he pulled out his phone to type it in, the light turned green, and she sped away, relieved to have escaped. She and her friends had a good laugh about it later, imagining the man's confusion when he called the fake number. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, she was at the movie theater across the street from her condo with two friends. As they were waiting in the concessions area, a man walked right up to her. It was him. "Hey," he said, "I tried calling you, but I think I got the wrong number." She was shocked by the coincidence, but tried to politely reiterate that she had a boyfriend and was uninterested. Her friends, sensing her discomfort, immediately became protective, one of them stepping up and telling him to back off. He mumbled something and said he'd see her later before walking away, leaving her deeply creeped out. The coincidences were just beginning. Over the next few days, he was at the traffic signal outside her condo every single morning. He had figured out her schedule. Every day, the Jaguar would be there, waiting. He would honk. He would roll down his window and yell, one time getting dangerously close to her car. She started driving with her windows up and her sunglasses on, trying to create a barrier, but she felt trapped. He hadn't technically done anything illegal yet, and she didn't know what to do. The situation escalated from deeply unsettling to genuinely terrifying when she was at her university library, a 15-minute drive from her home. She was in a quiet zone working when she noticed a man staring at her from a sofa area across the room. Her far sight wasn't great, but the stare was so persistent and unnerving that she asked a student sitting nearby to pretend to take a picture of her, angling the shot so the man was in the background. When she zoomed in on the photo, her blood ran cold. It was him. He wasn't a student. He had no bag, no books, nothing. He was just there, watching her. This was no longer a coincidence. He had followed her. He was actively hunting her. Freaked out of her mind, she went to the front desk and explained the situation. The staff thankfully took her seriously and arranged for the senior librarian, a 6-foot-tall man, to escort her all the way to her car. The drive home was filled with a new kind of paranoia. How did he find her? The answer, as her parents and boyfriend later concluded on a conference call, was almost certainly her car. That beautiful, distinctive rose gold car was like a beacon. It wouldn't be hard at all to follow the only car of its kind in the city. They devised a plan. She would switch cars with her boyfriend for a few weeks. To be extra careful, they would get illegally dark tints on both cars, so the creep couldn't see who was driving. She also changed her class schedule, leaving 2 hours earlier to throw him off her routine. The plan worked perfectly. For weeks, she was free. The Jaguar was gone from the morning traffic light, and the suffocating feeling of being watched finally began to lift. Then one day, she got a call from her boyfriend. "He's following me," he said. The creep had spotted her rose gold car and was now tailing her boyfriend, completely unaware that it wasn't her inside. Her boyfriend, staying calm, told her he was calling the police and to track his location on her phone. The police dispatcher laid out a clever and safe plan. They instructed him to drive to the local mall, which had a police station attached to it, and park. As the stalker followed him into the lot, a plainclothes officer approached the Jaguar, apprehended the man, and gave him a severe warning about stalking. The creep, finally confronted, could do nothing but stare daggers at her boyfriend the entire time. The ordeal was finally over. In the aftermath, her parents helped her move to a new home in a different neighborhood. She changed her license plate and even had the car's color changed to something more common. But the trauma remains. The experience taught her a horrifying lesson about how a predator, once fixed on a target, can use the most ordinary details of your life to systematically dismantle your world. Story 8. The dorm room intruder. This next story is a slow descent into a nightmare of escalating paranoia and violation. A terrifying tale that begins with a twisted prank and ends with an active, intimate, horrifying intrusion. The narrator was 17, a freshman in college, living in off-campus dorms that were run by a private management company, not the school. This distinction, she explains, was critical. The dorms were a hotbed of safety problems. Assaults, drug overdoses, and even shootings were not uncommon. As a small, 100-pound female, she was always acutely aware of her surroundings, constantly on guard. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came one morning in September. As she was leaving for class, she found a condom taped to the NAMA tag on her door. Attached to it was a note that read, "Call me, XOXO," followed by a random phone number. Pursuit, she reported it to the resident advisors, but nothing ever came of it. She tried to dismiss it as a crude but ultimately harmless prank by one of the guys on her floor. But the incident left a lingering sense of unease. Things with her roommates went south, largely due to her night terrors. And she was moved into a different 2-bedroom dorm with a new roommate named Jay. For a week, things were calm. Then, the weirdness started again. Small, out-of-place items began appearing in their shared living room while they were asleep. She asked Jay about it, but her roommate vehemently denied it was her. The mystery deepened when they discovered that the lock on their front door was faulty. If you pulled on the locked handle and twisted it just right, the door would pop open. It was around this same time that the narrator started receiving anonymous Snapchats. They were a disturbing mix of inappropriate pictures, vague but menacing threats, and creepy offers for great sex. The messages became unnervingly specific, with comments like, "You looked great today in that specific shirt," proving that whoever was sending them was watching her, and watching her closely. Why? She and Jay repeatedly reported the broken lock to the dorm management, but their complaints were ignored. It took 4 months, 8 separate complaints, and the threat of legal action before they finally fixed the door. The repair, however, did little to stop the harassment. Presents with notes for her still appeared outside their door, and the disturbing Snapchats continued. The narrator eventually moved out of the dorms and into an apartment with her then-boyfriend, desperate to escape the relentless, unseen tormentor. But the harassment followed her. She got a job in the dean's office at her college, answering phones, and the calls began. Every day, 3 or more calls would come in from randomly generated numbers, later discovered to be from apps like Viber and Skype. When she would answer with her professional greeting, "Class Dean's office, how may I help you?" she would be met with nothing but the sound of heavy, labored breathing for a few seconds before the line went dead. She initially thought it was just some kid pranking the office, until one day her coworker took a call. The person on the line specifically asked to speak with the narrator by name. Thinking it was a dean she had been working with, her coworker transferred the call. She answered, and again was met with the same heavy breathing, followed by a click. The situation was now undeniably personal and terrifyingly persistent. After she reported the ongoing harassment to the university's Title IX office, the threats escalated. Her stalker found her new apartment. One night in December, she was dog-sitting to large protective dogs. Around 11 p.m., she took them outside for their last walk of the night. To the right of her apartment building was a thick, dark patch of trees that was hard to see into. As she started to walk the dogs to the left, they suddenly began growling and barking ferociously at something in the trees. Thinking it was another dog, she tried to pull them away, but they wouldn't budge, their bodies rigid with aggression. She glanced over, and a tall man emerged from the trees. His face was obscured by a white mask, like Michael Myers. He started rushing directly towards her. The dogs, in a frenzy of barking and snarling, immediately placed themselves between her and the masked figure. He stopped short, thwarted by the 2 animals, and then disappeared back into the trees as she scrambled up the stairs and into the safety of her apartment. Shaken, but still trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life, she and her boyfriend broke up, and she moved into a new apartment alone. She soon discovered that the window in her ground-floor bedroom didn't lock. One morning she woke up, and everything seemed normal, until she went to the mirror to do her hair for work. She saw it, and a wave of nausea and disbelief washed over her. There was a bald spot on the back of her head. Her hair had been shaved in the middle of the night while she was asleep in her own bed. A frantic search of her room revealed an envelope. Inside, she found her missing hair, tied up in knots. She immediately called the police. Her investigation confirmed her worst fears. The window had been forced open. But they could find no fingerprints, no clues to who had violated her home and her person in such a bizarre and intimate way. They asked her to compile a list of everything that was missing. Besides her hair, the only things gone were 3 pairs of her dirty underwear. The investigation went nowhere, and the stalker was never caught. The narrator has since moved again, a constant refugee from an invisible, relentless pursuer. She now keeps bear spray next to her bed, a small, inadequate defense against a horror that has followed her, invaded her homes, and even touched her while she slept. Story 9. The Forgotten Years. This next story delves into the kind of deep, generational haunting that doesn't just create spooky occurrences, but seems to poison the very air you breathe and erase memories like a creeping fog. The narrator was 13 when her military family moved into a duplex in a small, dusty town they call V-Town. It was a place that had a certain run-down charm on the surface. But underneath, she felt a heavy, dark energy buzzing, an atmosphere so thick it felt hard to breathe. Her family lived there for 4 years, and while she has some good memories, the overwhelming feeling she recalls is one of being miserable and constantly deeply scared. They refer to this period of their lives as the Forgotten Years, a time that has become a black hole in their collective memory. They all have trouble remembering their time there as a whole, but they can recall certain vivid, terrifying bits and pieces. Events so traumatic they punch through the amnesiac haze. Their house was on Main Street, and behind it, a creek ran under a bridge and into a dam. The paranormal activity started subtly and then escalated. One night, the narrator and her mom were alone watching TV when they heard a loud, violent crash from upstairs. Armed with a plastic lightsaber and the phone pre-dialed to 911, they went to investigate her brother's room. They found a large toy, which they had placed in a toy chest earlier that evening, now thrown clear across the room. This was just the first of many instances of loud crashes and objects being thrown by an unseen force. Her little brother Danny, whose bedroom was a converted attic space across from hers, hated his room with a palpable terror. He spent most nights in that house curled up in the narrator's bed, often joined by their other 2 siblings. It became a nightly ritual for children huddled together for safety against the things that haunted the upstairs of that house. Danny would complain of a scratching sound coming from under his bed and from within the wall space right above his head. One night, he came into her room with tears streaming down his face and fresh, bloody scratches swelling on his upper back. He was a nail-biter, his nails chewed down to the quick. There was no way he could have made those marks himself. There was never an explanation. The narrator also experienced the scratching under her own bed on the rare nights she slept alone. She would hear disembodied voices, see wretched, distorted faces drifting around her head, and feel the bed itself begin to shake violently. She says she would have concluded she was losing her mind if she were the only one experiencing these things, but the terror was shared. She and her sister both saw a recurring apparition, a little boy who would sit just outside her bedroom door, peering through the crack to watch the siblings sleep. The entire family refused to enter the unfinished dirt floor basement due to a guttural growling, noise that would float around their heads and seem to follow them back up the stairs. Her youngest brother Elliot would frequently see men in top hats standing outside the old shed in their backyard. The source of this concentrated darkness, they later discovered, was steeped in the property's grim history. A local history buff revealed that the shed had originally been used as an ice house, built by the town's milkman who had also built their home. He would cut giant cubes of ice from the creek behind their house in the winter and store them in the shed. But the truly horrifying revelation was what lay beneath it. The small crawl space under the ice house, a place the children had played in, was where the townspeople would store their deceased during the winter, waiting for the ground to thaw enough to dig a proper grave. Their backyard was, in essence, a temporary morgue. The entire town felt blanketed by a heavy cloud of negative energy. And for the narrator, it all seemed to stem from the dam just 300 feet from their house. She remembers sitting on the edge of it, staring into the vicious, black, frothy water, and feeling a suicidal pull, a temptation to slip over the edge, just as several other residents of V-Town had done before her. When she was 17, her father retired from the military. The family quickly relocated, leaving the house in V-Town behind. It sat on the market for 6 months before finally being foreclosed on. A month after the foreclosure, driven by a morbid curiosity, the narrator and a few friends decided to spend the night in the abandoned, haunted house, hoping to capture some evidence of the paranormal. They easily broke in and camped out in her old bedroom with a simple voice recorder running. The house, she says, seemed to rebel against their presence. They heard dishes breaking in the empty kitchen, heavy stomping up and down the multiple staircases, and that same deep growling that had terrified them in the basement. After 5 hours of escalating activity, punctuated by disembodied laughing and knocking, they fled in terror. The narrator never found out what, if anything, was on that voice recorder. She says that sometimes she wishes she could remember every creepy thing that happened in that house to fill in the missing chunks of her life. But mostly, she's glad that she can't. The trauma of those years helped her discover that she is an empath, highly sensitive to the paranormal, and she knows that nothing she has experienced since will ever compare to the constant, suffocating feelings of horror and dread they all endured in the V-Town house. Story 10. The Devil in the Living Room. For our final story, we have an account that is not just creepy or unsettling. It is a descent into absolute visceral horror. This is a story about the terrifying fragility of the human mind and the darkness that can rush in to fill the cracks. The narrator begins by setting the stage about 2 years prior, when he and his brother Jacob were living with a roommate named Alex. From the start, Alex was an enigma. The narrator describes him as rather odd, someone he suspected might be homosexual due to his mannerisms and the way he talked and dressed. But confusingly, Alex would constantly make fun of gay people, a contradiction that never quite sat right. This perception was seemingly shattered when Alex introduced them to his new long-distance girlfriend, Kelly. For a while it seemed Alex was settling into a normal, if distant, relationship, spending most of his free time on Skype with her. The first signs of a deeper trouble began to surface when Alex started coming home late at night, looking exhausted and disheveled, sometimes with his shirt on inside out. The narrator and his brother suspected he was cheating on Kelly, but it wasn't their business, so they kept their theories to themselves. The truth, however, was far more complex and would prove to be the catalyst for Alex's complete unraveling. When Kelly came to visit, she discovered a dating app on Alex's phone. It was an app for gay men, filled with messages detailing sexual encounters he'd been having. She also found he was using Craigslist to look for one-night stands with other men. Kelly's reaction was not one of quiet heartbreak, it was one of explosive fury. In an act of profound cruelty and public humiliation, she forced Alex to write a public apology on his Facebook page. Alex was a graduate student, and his Facebook was filled with colleagues, teachers, and professional contacts. The post went out, and suddenly, everyone in his academic and social circle knew his most private secrets. The humiliation broke him. Alex was utterly devastated. He stopped talking to the narrator and his brother, retreating into a shell of shame and despair. He was financially broke, and his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He stopped eating almost entirely, subsisting on nothing but black coffee, and began reading the Bible with a frantic, obsessive fervor. He was a man teetering on the edge of a precipice. Then came the day of the incident. The narrator had plans to get lunch with his girlfriend after school, but as they were about to meet, he was struck by a powerful, inexplicable feeling, an urgent, gut-wrenching certainty that he needed to go home immediately. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling was so overwhelming that he canceled his plans and went straight back to the house. He found Alex sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, his eyes vacant and unresponsive. The narrator tried to start a conversation, asking if he was okay, if he wanted to talk, but it was like he wasn't even there. Alex didn't acknowledge him, didn't even seem to register his presence. Unsettled, the narrator left him alone and went upstairs to the bathroom. A few minutes later, he heard it. The sounds started floating up from downstairs, screaming, then a low guttural growling, followed by a burst of chilling, manic laughter, then more growling. He slowly made his way back downstairs, his heart beginning to pound. The scene that greeted him was the beginning of a nightmare. Alex was on the floor of the living room, his body twisting and contorting as if he were in unimaginable pain, still screaming and laughing intermittently. The narrator yelled at him, trying to snap him out of it, but Alex was lost to him. The room felt unnaturally, intensely cold. At one point, Alex's writhing stopped. He became still and looked directly at the narrator. His eyes were completely rolled back in his head, leaving only the terrifying blank white. And then, in a demonic voice that was nothing like his own, a voice that spoke perfect, unaccented English, completely devoid of his usual thick Hispanic accent, he said, "It's the devil." The narrator froze, pure terror locking his limbs in place. Alex then began speaking in a strange, guttural language that sounded like it was being played backward, his tongue darting and moving like a snake's. Panicked and not knowing what else to do, the narrator ran outside and called a friend of Alex's, a pastor named Daniel. When he went back inside to wait, the horror had escalated. Alex was now lying on his back, holding a butcher knife against his own stomach. Fearing what would happen, the narrator waited outside for the pastor to arrive. When Daniel finally got there, they entered the house together, and what they saw was a scene of unimaginable carnage. The narrator's heart dropped, his mind refusing to process the bloody tableau in front of him. Alex had stabbed himself. He was lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood, actively, consciously, pulling out his own intestines with his bare hands. Daniel told him to go outside and call 911 immediately, while the narrator frantically explained the horrific situation to the dispatcher. Daniel went to Alex's side and began to pray over him, demanding in the name of Jesus Christ to speak to Alex. But all he got back was the strange backward language and the guttural growling. Paramedics arrived and began working on Alex, who finally lost consciousness. The police subjected the narrator to hours of intense questioning, even taking him into custody for a time, suspecting he was somehow responsible. He was eventually released, and that night, after the house was blessed by the pastors, he had a terrifying dream. In the dream, he saw a creature that looked like the demon from Insidious or Darth Maul, with a black and red face, which attacked his hotel room door before laughing and saying, "Well played." He has always wondered if that was the same entity that had taken over his roommate. Alex barely survived, spending 2 months in the hospital with severe internal damage. The narrator was left with deep psychological trauma and recurring nightmares of the event. But he holds on to one chilling, unshakable belief, that the strange, urgent sensation he had to go home that day was the only thing that saved Alex's life.